There's a passage that's been misunderstood for nearly 2,000 years. Most people think Jesus was talking about church policy or denominational authority when he said it. But what Smith Wigglesworth understood, what changed his entire ministry, was that this passage describes the actual mechanics of how human consciousness shapes reality itself. And you've been operating this power your whole life, usually in the dark. Before we go deeper, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what limitation you're currently struggling to break free from. I read every comment, and these conversations actually shape what we explore next. Matthew 16:19. Most people read that and think it's about ecclesiastical power. Rules. What's allowed in church? What's forbidden? But the original Hebrew word used by Jewish scholars for bind and loose meant something far more radical. It meant to establish as law, to make something binding in the spiritual realm. And the Greek construction in Matthew makes something shocking clear. The word order suggests that what you bind on earth is already bound in heaven. What you loose on earth is already loosed in heaven. This isn't you commanding heaven to obey you. This is about recognizing a law that's already in operation. Here's what Wigglesworth saw that changed everything. Smith. Wigglesworth was born in 1859 in Yorkshire, England. He couldn't read. He was poor. By every measure, he had no business becoming one of the most powerful healing ministers in Christian history. But he understood one principle so deeply that it overrode every limitation his circumstances presented. One afternoon, he was called to pray for a woman with a tumor. The family thought it was hopeless. The doctor had already pronounced it terminal. As Wigglesworth prayed, the woman died. And Wigglesworth's response reveals everything about how he understood binding and loosing. He didn't accept the binding of death. And her body began to tremble. The woman came back to life, went back to bed, and lived. What did Wigglesworth do? He refused to bind the condition that others had bound. He exercised the authority to unbind death itself. Now, here's where most spiritual teaching gets fuzzy. When Romans chapter 12:2 tells us to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, Paul isn't talking about positive thinking. He's talking about something your consciousness does that literally reshapes your experience. Your mind doesn't just believe, it binds. It establishes spiritual law in your personal reality. Every time you accept a diagnosis, you're binding that disease. Every time you look at your bank account and inwardly agree with lack, you're binding poverty into your life. Every time you rehearse a failure and accept it as your identity, you're using this binding power against yourself. Think about fear, worry. Have you noticed that the things you fear most often come to pass? That's not luck. That's not the universe punishing you. That's binding in action. You've been using this spiritual mechanism to establish your own nightmare as law in your experience. But, and this is the part that changes everything, you have the exact same authority to unbind these things. Notice the order. You say, you believe, you receive. That sequence is the binding process in reverse. You unbind the mountain by declaring it removed before you see the evidence. You're exercising spiritual authority over circumstances, not through force, but through the authority of your spoken word combined with your internal agreement. Wigglesworth saw this in his documentation of miracles. A 95-year-old man with 3 years of stomach cancer walked into a meeting expecting to die. Wigglesworth prayed, and the man's consciousness shifted. He didn't bind the cancer anymore. He bound healing. And within hours, that man was eating solid food for the first time in months, with no pain, no limitation. Was it a miracle? Absolutely. But it was a miracle that operated through a law, the law of binding and loosing. The problem is, you're still binding the wrong things. Here's what happens in most people's lives. They wake up. Their circumstances haven't changed overnight, so they bind those circumstances again. Their job situation is what it was yesterday. They bind it again. Their relationship is strained. They bind the strain again. By evening, they've reinforced the exact conditions they want to escape from. But Wigglesworth operated differently. He walked into a situation where death had already bound someone, where medical science had bound them to a diagnosis, where circumstance had bound them to limitation, and he exercised his authority to unbind. Not through denial, not through pretending reality doesn't exist, but by exercising a higher authority over that reality. That's Proverbs 23:7. Your thinking binds, your inner agreements establish conditions. Your consciousness operates like a spiritual contract. Whatever you agree with, you're bound to experience. But notice something that most people miss. If thinking binds, then changing your thinking unbinds. If internal agreement establishes conditions, then withdrawing internal agreement dissolves conditions. That's not visualization. That's not affirmation. That's the actual spiritual mechanism that Jesus taught, that Wigglesworth understood, that you've been operating unconsciously your entire life. The question that changes everything. Ask yourself right now, what have I been binding? Not accidentally, not unconsciously anymore, but what conditions, what limitations, what truths have I been establishing as law in my experience through my repeated agreement? Your fear patterns? You've bound those. Your financial struggle? You've bound that by accepting it as unchangeable. Your health situation? You've bound that by treating the diagnosis as your destiny rather than a temporary condition. And the second question, what am I prepared to unbind? Because that's where the power is. Not in getting God to change something, not in begging the universe, but in you recognizing that you've been operating this authority all along and deciding to use it differently. Wigglesworth would walk into hospitals. He wouldn't accept what doctors had bound. He wouldn't bind what society called permanent. He would exercise his authority to unbind death, disease, limitation. And reality would reorganize itself around his binding and loosing. That authority wasn't special to him. Matthew 16:19 wasn't written just for Peter. Jesus is addressing all the disciples. This is your authority. This has always been your authority. The question isn't whether you have this power. The question is what you're building with it. What are you establishing as law in your life through your daily agreements, your internal yes or no, your acceptance or refusal? Subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on the notification bell. Because what we're exploring here isn't theory. It's the actual mechanics of how consciousness creates reality, how one man who couldn't read understood something that changed nations, and how you can exercise the same authority starting today. The binding and loosing isn't coming. It's not future. It's not something you have to earn. You're doing it right now. The only question is, are you doing it deliberately?